Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. Truckers referred to it as the Dead Stretch, a desolate, lonely 50-meter stretch of Highway 59 that ran through East Texas's deep woods. The road was old and worn, and long-haul drivers were known for strange sightings and eerie occurrences. Veteran trucker Jake Henderson gave much credence to local legends or ghost stories. That was before one unforgettable night when Jake had just picked up a load from Laredo, Texas, headed for Memphis. He looked at his map and saw that the quickest route passed through the Dead Stretch. He shrugged off the uneasiness that descended on him, a thick blanket. Jake had driven that road a few times in his career, but it was getting close to midnight as he approached the entrance to the Dead Stretch, and the radio crackled with static before cutting out altogether. A quick check of his dashboard confirmed that he had lost the signal. There was no music or chatter, just the silence that oppressed the shadows, long and unnatural. He could never explain why it felt different. The faint shape of trees loomed on either side of the highway, their branches curving like skeleton fingers reaching toward the sky, the moon. Jake didn't think it was a big concern, despite the heavy thudding of his heartbeat and the low rumble of his rig's engine. He had driven darker, more desolate highways in worse conditions. Jake yawned, rubbed his eyes, and reached for his thermos as he unscrewed the cap. Something darted across the road, and his hands reflexively jerked the wheel, causing the truck to swerve violently to the side. The scene was obscured by dense clouds, creating an inky darkness. His headlights appeared to have been swallowed by the night, barely illuminating the road ahead. He shook his head and laughed uneasily before he corrected it. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, his heart pounding in his chest. "It wasn't a deer or coyote. I'm used to seeing wildlife, but this was different. It was almost human in shape, but twisted like something had gone horribly wrong in its creation." After a few miles, everything was quiet once more, as the steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic bounce of the tires over the cracked asphalt started to lull him back. He was exhausted from too many long nights, so he sat back in his seat, gripped the wheel tightly, and looked ahead at the darkened road. His knuckles were white. Jake muttered a curse under his breath as he pulled over to the side of the road, the huge rig moaning to a halt. The engine sputtered and died, leaving only silence. And then the truck's temperature gauge spiked. A harsh, red light blinked angrily on his dashboard. After a moment of sitting there and listening to the utter silence, no crickets, no breeze, nothing, Jake reached for the CB radio, turned it on, and tried to call out to anyone on the road. "Number 1, this is Big Jake. Anyone out there? Static, come on." He tapped the microphone nervously, but the static abruptly stopped and was replaced by a low, guttural whisper. Jake froze, the sound sending a chill down his spine. The voice was so fainted that he wasn't even certain it was real. "Breaker 1, and more static." When he returned, Jake dropped the microphone, his heart pounding, and he reached for his flashlight, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the night. The cold air pricked his skin. He walked around to the front of the truck, popping the hood and shining the flashlight over the engine. But he knew he wouldn't find anything, because the truck had been fine just moments before a sound made he stopped cold. It was dim, like the crunch of gravel beneath his feet. He slowly lowered the flashlight, and as it swept across the empty highway, he noticed a figure standing just at the edge of the light. Jake blinked, not sure if his weary eyes were deceiving him, but it appeared to be swaying slowly to one side. Although it was too far away to see any characteristics, there was something strange and unnerving about it. "Hey Jake," he said. In the stillness, "You're all right." Jake took a cautious step forward and shone the flashlight straight at the figure, which was still swaying. The figure wasn't swaying. Rather, it was hanging from a tree branch by a noose. Jake's body was limp and swaying gently in the wind that had suddenly picked him up. He staggered back, his mind racing, and he looked up and down the road, but there was nothing there. The beam struck the figure, freezing Jake and catching his breath in his throat. He rushed back to the truck, slamming the door shut, unlocking it as panic struck him. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the keys, desperately trying to start the engine. The truck roared to life, and Jake floored the gas, tearing down the road. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and for a brief moment, Jake's figure was gone. Jake assumed he had dreamt it all. But then the voice came again, stronger this time, coming from the CB radio. His eyes jumped to the radio, which was off, but the whisper kept eating at the corners of his eyes. Jake's sanity returned when he slammed his fist into the radio, and the whisper suddenly stopped. He took a deep breath to calm himself, his mind racing with ideas of what he had witnessed, and he realized that he needed to leave the dead stretch. As he pressed on, he noticed a pair of headlights in the distance. As the lights drew nearer, Jake's relief turned to dread. The approaching vehicle wasn't a truck. Rather, it was an old, rusted car that he hadn't seen in decades. His father had owned the same model of Ford Fairlane back when he was younger. He felt a wave of relief as another trucker approached. Perhaps they had seen something too, or, at least, he'd have some company on this cursed road. Although Jake was only a child, he was aware that his father had died in the collision, because he had been present when the car sped toward him. Its headlights blinding him, Jake swerved. His heart pounding in his chest, the truck veered wildly, its tires screeching on the asphalt, and he barely yanked the wheel back. The road behind him was empty when Jake's phone buzzed in the passenger seat, and he grabbed it with shaking hands as a new text message from an unknown number flashed on the screen. "You can't leave." Before he could react, he avoided a ditch and came to a stop, sitting there panting and staring into the rearview mirror. Appeared again, this time right behind him. It was the same rusted car that Jake Owens had been driving on long-haul routes for almost 20 years. He had witnessed everything, including the drunk drivers, the fog so dense that a knife could cut it, and the late-night highway madness. He had heard tales from other truckers about haunted sections of the road, strange lights in the sky, and even truck stops on the fringe of CB radio. It was mid-October, just as the full air was beginning to bite, and Jake had a load to haul from Dallas up through the Ozarks to a warehouse in St. Louis. He planned to drive through the night, as usual. Because the highway was quieter, Jake didn't believe in the ghosts of old drivers that were said to linger there. Ghosts were for movies, and UFOs, hell, those were for the conspiracy nuts. He liked the alone, so he checked his watch, 11:45 p.m., tossed his duffel bag in the cab, and turned on the engine. Jake eased his 18-wheeler into the road after making a brief phone call to his wife. It was a few hours into the drive, somewhere along a desolate stretch, and the dashboard of the interstate glowed dimly in the dark cab. The only sound was the hum of the engine as he settled into the long, boring drive. He lit a cigarette and switched the radio to his favorite classic rock station, which filled the cab with the familiar sounds of the Eagles and CCR. Jake felt a chill go up his spine as he glanced in the rearview mirror after the first odd thing happened on I-44 in Missouri. His headlights caught something moving by the side of the road, just out of his line of sight. It was a brief flash of a figure, but it was too large to be a deer or any other animal he would expect out here. He shrugged it off, telling himself it was probably just fatigue playing tricks on him. A little further down the road, his CB radio crackled to life with a burst of static, and Jake raised an eyebrow he hadn't noticed before. He had been expecting to see something, but all he saw was darkness behind him, with the faint red glow. of his tail lights barely penetrating the pitch black. He hadn't touched it in hours and wasn't expecting to hear anyone out this late. But then a voice cut in faintly over the static at breaker 1, and you were there. Jake went across and took the microphone, and he said, "Yeah, this is Jake who's out there." Jake puzzled. Perhaps it was just another trucker or interference. He was about to put the microphone down farther up the road when the voice came again, clearer this time, and he was told to watch out for him. Jake's blood ran cold. The voice was oddly calm, but somehow hollow, as if it didn't belong on the radio. He sat there, staring at the microphone in his hand, not knowing whether to answer, or to ignore it. He thought someone was playing tricks on him, so he asked, "Who the hell is this?" in a slightly shakier voice than he had intended, and there was no response, just dead air. Jake put down the microphone, his pulse quickening, and tried to concentrate on the road, but the strange warning kept repeating in his head. Watch out for him. Watch out for who? A dense fog had started to roll in, and the visibility was for the first time in years. Jake felt uneasy behind the wheel as his truck sliced through the fog, which clung to the road like a wet blanket swirling in ghostly tendrils. The road ahead vanished into a sea of mist, and Jake slowed down, squinting through the haze. At that moment, he noticed a figure standing on the man, who was wearing a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat, stood motionless near a rest stop entrance, on the side of the road, barely visible through the fog. Shadows covered his face, but there was something unnerving about the way he watched the truck approach. Jake slowed the rig hiss as the truck drove past. Jake glanced in his rearview mirror. The man's headlights cut through the fog as he went by, but instead of moving or raising his thumb, hitchhiker would, he stood there and watched Jake's heart pound in his chest. He held the wheel hard, his palms damp with sweat. Jake cursed under his breath and pushed the pedal down again, trying to push through the fog and the weird gnawing feeling in his stomach. 20 minutes later, he pulled into a truck stop, needing a break from the traffic. He tapped the brakes and looked out the window, scanning the roadside, but there was no sign of the stranger or anyone else inside the dingy little diner attached to the truck stop. The air was stale and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Jake ordered a coffee and sat at the counter, his mind still replaying the strange night. Erie Road was empty except for a few other rigs parked under the dim lights. Jake climbed out of the cab and lit another cigarette, breathing in the cold air and trying to shake off the weirdness of the night. Jake forced a smile. The waitress placed the steaming cup in front of him and said, "You look like you've seen a ghost." The old man sitting a few stalls down laughed and said, "You've been on the dead man's curve." But Jake turned to face him and raised an eyebrow. "That's what the old man leaned. That stretch of road you're heading toward is known as Dead Man's Curve, and drivers claim to see things out there that shouldn't be on the highway." Jake took a sip of his coffee and tried to ignore the chill that had set in his bones. His grizzled face is lined with years of hard living. Jake froze his coffee cup halfway to his lips as the elderly man's remarks rang too closely to what he had just witnessed. "Hey buddy," Jake said, trying. He murmured, his eyes wide. "Truckers pick up hitchhikers that aren't there. See men standing on the road that vanish when you look back. Hear voices on the radio." To maintain his tone, "Have you ever heard someone on the CB warn you to keep an eye out for him?" The elderly man's face became white, and he remained still for a while before leaning closer. "You heard that?" "Yeah," and his voice lowered to a hoarse whisper. "So you have a problem, friend?" The old man looked around as if to see if anyone was listening, and it was him, the man in the hat, who said, "If you see him, if you hear that voice, it means he's coming for you." Jake stared at him, his heart thumping in his ears. "What are you talking about?" Jake felt the blood drain from his mind racing. He threw some cash on the counter and stormed out of the diner, slamming the coffee cup down and pushing back from the counter. That was enough. His hands shaking, he started the engine and climbed back into his rig. The road ahead of him was empty and dark, and he drove in silence for a while. When he saw something in the fog up ahead, his heart skipped a beat, because he recognized the outline, the same man in the hat who was standing in the middle of the road, right in Jake's path. The fog was still thick around him. The truck was rumbling along the highway. The radio remained silent, and the CB turned off. Jake's rig hurtled directly toward him as he tried to stop, but the man didn't move, so Jake slammed on the brakes, causing the truck to skid. Just before impact, the figure disappeared, and Jake sat there, breathing heavily, the fog swirling around the front of his truck, when a voice came from the passenger seat. The story ends there. The night air was dense with fog as Nate Collins drove his 18-wheeler along a remote highway in northern Nevada. The only sound on that long, deserted stretch of road was the rumble of the engine. The voice was calm, hollow, and I told you to keep an eye out for him. Jake turned slowly, his heart thumping in his chest. The man in the hat was sitting in the seat next to him, grinning. Nate had been a truck driver for more than 15 years, and he was accustomed to lonely nights and long hours behind the wheel. There was a time when he would have loved this aspect of his job, the freedom, the solitude, the endless blacktop stretching to the horizon. But tonight something felt strange. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was oppressively conspicuous. He had always dismissed the wheel and the odd encounters with drunks stumbling onto the road and strange lights flickering in the sky, attributing them to fatigue or chance. But recently he had been plagued by a creeping sense of dread that he couldn't explain. It began around a week ago when he was driving late one night through Utah. Similarly, Nate had not touched his radio in hours and didn't anticipate hearing anyone outside when it crackled to life with static on desolate road. However, as he turned the volume up, a low voice crackled through the static and turned back. It was barely a whisper, nearly drowned out by the static, but it was distinct enough to make Nate's hair stand on end. He attempted to answer, asking who it was, but the voice didn't return, so he turned off the radio and finished his run that evening, his hands shaking a little on the steering wheel. But he couldn't get rid of the feeling that something or someone had been warning him not to continue. And ever since then, Nate felt like he was being watched every night. He hadn't noticed anything yet, but as he maneuvered his vehicle through the fog tonight, he sensed the presence more strongly than ever before. He looked at the 12:30 a.m. clock on his dashboard and saw that something was following him, keeping pace just beyond the edge of his headlights. His eyes raced to the rearview mirror, but all he saw was darkness. He was already hours behind schedule, since a huge storm had delayed him down earlier in the night, and now this awful fog was making visibility difficult. Nate shook his head in an attempt to concentrate on the road. "Get it together, Collins," he muttered to himself. "You're just tired. It's all in your head." Despite this, he couldn't get rid of the feeling that something wasn't right. His headlights barely broke through the wall of fog in front of him, creating odd shifting shadows along the road that seemed to disappear the farther he drove. Up ahead, through the thick fog, he noticed a faint flickering light on the roadside. As he approached, he recognized it as a gas station, or what was left of one. The building appeared deserted, with windows broken and paint peeling off the walls, and the only indication of life was a single flickering light above the entrance. Nate scowled, didn't recall this location, and he had traveled this route many times before, but there it was, sitting on the highway side like a relic from another era. His instincts told him to keep going, but he hadn't stopped 4 hours, and his fuel gauge was dropping dangerously low, so he reluctantly pulled off the road and maneuvered his truck into the empty lot of the gas station. The engine roared to a halt, leaving a spooky silence behind it. The fog clung to the building, giving it an even more sinister appearance. Nate got out of the cab, his boots crunching on the gravel, and approached the pump, shaking it. Nate cursed under his breath as he realized there was no way this thing would work. He was about to turn back to his truck when he heard a faint creak. The feeling of being watched was stronger now, as if fires were burning into the back of his neck. The pump was old and ancient, even the kind that hadn't been used in decades. Nate's skin pricked with goosebumps as he heard a door open slowly behind him. His heart pounded in his chest, and he froze. He turned toward the gas station, where the front door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind. But there was no wind. That night, a voice whispered in his head, "Don't go inside." But his feet moved anyhow, and the door creaked louder as he got closer to the darkness inside the building, which seemed to follow all. The air was heavy with dust, and the smell of mildew hit him hard as Nate paused at the threshold. Looking into the black emptiness beyond the flickering light above the door cast long shadows across the floor. The shelves were long empty and abandoned, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of grease. Nate lit up the room with his flashlight, his heart thumping louder every second. And then he noticed a figure standing in the store's far corner, shrouded in shadow. It was incredibly tall, with limbs that seemed to long for its body, and a head that was cocked at an odd angle as if it had broken. Nate's breath caught in his throat as the faceless figure cautiously approached him. Nate staggered backward, slamming into a shelf, while the faceless figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, seemingly enjoying the moment. The flashlight flickered in his hand, casting erratic with his heart thumping in his ears. He fumbled for the door as beams of light filled the room. Suddenly, the radio in his truck came to life, and the same voice from earlier whispered in the static. Nate's blood ran cold, and he ran for the door, his boots slipping on the dirty floor. Before bursting out into the fog, he heard heavy footsteps behind him, slow but steady, getting closer every second. He threw himself into the cab, slammed the door shut, and locked it with trembling hands. His breath came in ragged gasps as he floored the gas pedal and jammed the keys into the ignition. For a brief moment, Nate let himself think he had escaped when the truck roared to life, its tires screeching as it tore out of the lot and back onto the highway. He looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but fog, but instead he saw the figure standing in the middle of the road, barely visible through the mist, watching him. And then it began to move slowly, but purposefully. It wasn't walking, rather, it was gliding toward him, bringing them closer with terrifying speed. As Nate pushed the accelerator to the floor, the truck roared down the highway. But no matter how quickly he went, the radio crackled again, the voice whispering through the static that you couldn't outrun him. Nate's hands tightened on the wheel, his knuckles white with fear, and his mind raced, trying to figure out what the hell was. The figure seemed to keep pace, always just behind him, a shadow in the fog, getting closer and closer. 4 hours, Nate drove through the fog without ever stopping or slowing down, and the figure was always behind him. Was he hallucinating? Was this some sort of nightmare? But it felt too real. The cold sweat on his skin, the pounding in his heart, the weight of the figure's presence just behind him. As dawn broke, the fog began to lift, the road became clear, and the sky turned a pale shade of grey. Nate looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure still following him, but it was gone. The voice on the radio continued its whispers, filling his mind with dread that he couldn't escape. With a shaky breath and a trembling body from exhaustion, Nate pulled into a rest stop as the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon. He parked the truck and sat there for a long time, staring out at the sky. The weight of the terror from the night still hung over him, but whatever figure it was had vanished for the time being. With his pulse still pounding and his mind still reeling from what had transpired, he grabbed for the radio, his fingers hovering over the dial, paused, and turned it on. Static filled the cab, but this time there was quiet instead of voices or whispers. Nate closed his eyes and exhaled deeply. Perhaps it was over. Perhaps whatever had been pursuing him was gone forever. But he knew deep down that it wasn't yet. Nate Tucker had been a truck driver for nearly 20 years, and he knew one thing. Indeed, night driving messed with your mind. He had witnessed it happen to other truckers who claimed to have seen ghosts crossing the highway or UFOs dipping in and out of the clouds. But Nate had always maintained his composure and refused to let the distance blur the distinction between the real world and the strange things. It was 2:30 a.m. when Nate drove his rig down Route 50, a desolate, endless stretch of highway through the Nevada desert that is notoriously known as the loneliest road in America. Drivers talked about him at truck stops because he was practical and had a wife and 2 children back home in Kansas City who needed him to be sane. However, tonight felt different. The radio hit static that cut in and out of country tunes, and the closest settlement was almost 100 meters away. For more than an hour, only the steady hum of his motor and the endless expanse of road ahead had passed. Perhaps the silence was starting to get to me. When he looked at the dashboard clock and saw the numbers glowing dimly in the dark cab, Nate shook his head and swung the radio's volume knob in the hopes of finding a station that didn't cut in and out. The static briefly subsided, and then a gritty voice interrupted the conversation, sounding like someone talking into a CB radio. "He should be careful tonight." Nate round grabbed the CB mic and pressed the button after hearing a voice crackle and then disappear into the static. If anyone out there had anything to say to me, it was all white noise. Nate felt a chill go up his spine, but he shook it off, assuming that some pranksters were playing with the airwaves and boring kids with their dad's CB. The road stretched out in front of him. The desert landscape blurred in the distance. The stars above were too bright for comfort, and the vastness of the sky really made him feel more alone. Nate adjusted his seat, flicked on his high beams, and pressed the pedal down a little harder. A little over 30 miles later, a figure appeared in the distance. At first, Nate thought it was his imagination, but as the truck roared closer, the shape became clearer, a man standing on the highway. White lines marked the highway, but occasionally he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. Just the shadow of a rock or a tumbleweed bouncing across the road. At least that's what he told himself, his thumb out in the universal hitchhiker gesture. He said, under his breath, "Hell no, Nate." He hadn't picked up a hitchhiker in more than 10 years, and he wasn't going to start tonight. Not out here, not in this remote area of the road with no cell service and miles between civilization. But something about the figure drew his attention. The man's posture was stiff, almost unnaturally still, as if he was watching the headlights swept across him rather than actually waiting to be picked up. Nate's heart pounded sharply in his chest. The hitchhiker was wearing Nate's rig roared past, and he tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He was wearing an old-fashioned trucker's jacket, one of those heavy denim ones with patches stitched onto it. His face was completely hidden by the brim of his hat, casting deep shadows over his features. When he looked in his rearview mirror, Nate thought he saw the hitchhiker fading into the distance, but instead he saw that he had vanished. He blinked and looked at the mirror once more, but the area where the man had been standing was deserted, as if no one had been there at all. Nate massaged his eyes, forcing himself to concentrate on the road ahead. Another 20 minutes went by, and the feeling of dread in his eyes grew stronger as he shook his head harder this time. He wasn't exhausted enough to be hallucinating, but perhaps he needed a break. There was something wrong with this section of Route 50, which Nate had driven a dozen times and knew well enough, but tonight it felt endless, with no mileage markers or road signs, just the same bleak landscape repeating itself with rocks, scrub, brush, and the far-off outlines of mountains covered in. Nate's blood froze as he grabbed the microphone, because there was a long pause over the radio with static hissing and popping. It was dark when the CB radio burst to life again. "Hey driver," the voice sounded deeper this time, closer, like the speaker was right there in the cab with him. Nate's heart stopped, and he slammed the microphone down and flipped off the CB, refusing to listen to another word. His hands were sweaty as he gripped the wheel, and his mind raced, trying to find an explanation or a joke. It had to be a joke. Another driver messing up. It seemed alive, But then the voice returned, only a whisper. Now you should have picked him up. Perhaps there was a signal coming from the mountains with him. But his headlights suddenly detected movement ahead, and Nate's stomach turned over when he saw the hitchhiker again. It was the same man, with the same denim jacket and hat covering his face, but this time he wasn't standing on the side of the road. Instead, he was in the center of it. Nate applied the brakes and the truck's tires. The world slowed down as the truck came to a screeching halt, just inches from where the hitchhiker had been standing. But the man was gone. Nate's breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as he stared at the empty road in front of him, his hands shaking on the asphalt. Nate's heart pounded in his ears as he struggled to keep the rig from tipping the wheel, and for the first time in years, he felt truly terrified. He couldn't tell how long he sat there, heart pounding, adrenaline coursing through his veins. But when he eventually snapped out of it, the fog had rolled in, engulfing everything in its path: the road, the desert, the sky. Nate swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on him. He reached for the ignition, his fingers shaking as he turned the key. The engine roared to life, but the sound was muted by the dense fog, so he had to keep moving and leave. All that was left was the heavy mist and the faint glow of his truck's headlights. Every nerve in his body was tense, waiting for something to jump out at him. The CB radio crackled as the truck rumbled forward, creeping through the fog. Nate's knuckles were white on the wheel as he limped along, straining to see even a few feet in front of him. Once more, even though it was turned off too late, Nate's blood ran cold as he looked at the radio and felt his heart racing. His instincts told him to run as far away from this road as he could, so he stepped on the gas to make the truck move more quickly. But the fog was too dense on the road. Nate's heart raced as he slammed on the brakes again, but it was too late, because the truck lurched as something heavy hit the front grille. The sound was a sickening dull thud, followed by a metallic screech. He couldn't risk crashing, for a figure appeared in the fog directly in front of him. He stopped the rig and flung open the door, scurrying out of the cab and running to the front of the truck, his boots crunching on the gravel as he rounded the front of the vehicle in anticipation of seeing the hitchhiker's body crumpled on the road. But there was nothing there. Nate's hands shook as he combed his hair, and he backed up, looking around the mist for any indication of what he had struck. He couldn't have imagined it, but he felt the impact and heard it. And then he heard slow, deliberate footsteps. Behind him, Nate turned around, his breath catching in his throat. The hitchhiker was standing inches in front of him, his head tilted up, and the brim of his hat pushed back just enough to show his face, or what should have been a face, but all that was visible was smooth, pale skin stretched taut over bone. Nate staggered backward, his legs buckling as he struck the ground with a hard blow. The radio buzzed as the faceless figure loomed over him, mute and motionless. It was time to go, and Nate, the driver, shouted and scrambled to his feet. But the fog closed in around him before he could move. The last sound he heard was his own heartbeat thumping in his ears. No one ever located Nate Tucker or his truck. All that was left was his CB radio crackling with static and the whispers. Eddie Malone had been traveling for almost 20 years and had witnessed everything from tornadoes tearing across the landscape to freak snowstorms in the Rockies. He took pride in being a logical man who didn't believe in ghosts or superstitions. But that night, the one that began like any other long haul, was the one that caused him to doubt everything. It was the dead of night, and the air was slicing through the barren New Mexico desert on Interstate 40. Eddie yawned, keeping one hand on the wheel and the other wrapped around his thermos. The strong, bitter coffee was the only thing that prevented him from pulling over and passing out right there on the shoulder of the delivery truck. It was dry, the kind of stillness that presses in around you like a blanket. His 18-wheelers, headlights cut through the darkness, the beams flickering every now and then as if the desert itself was trying to swallow them. Until he arrived in Flagstaff, his CB radio was crackling in the background, but for the past hour, all he could hear was white noise and sporadic snippets of conversation from truckers too far away to see. He turned the dial in search of music or anything else to break the monotony of. When Eddie first saw the lights, he thought they were another truck approaching quickly behind him. The bright headlights in his rearview mirror were burning through the darkness like two blazing suns, but as the lights got brighter, he realized that there was nothing but the road, the desert, and nothing at all. He saw that something was wrong when he got closer. The lights were too high and too wide, and they weren't from a truck or any other car he had ever seen on the road. He squinted Ed and leaned forward to get a better look, but the lights disappeared as if they had never been there. Eddie rubbed his eyes and shook his head. He was just tired. He looked at the time, to 18 a.m., and realized that fatigue had a way of playing tricks on your head. He continued to drive, telling himself that the sooner he kept going, the sooner he could pull into a motel and sleep it off the sooner. He got to Flagstaff, but a few miles later, the lights came back, but this time they were in front of him, floating just above the road, shimmering in the desert air, to bright orbs hovering like some sort of eerie nighttime signal. As Eddie slowed the truck down, his grip tightened on the steering wheel. The lights were too close to ignore now, too real to be a trick of his exhausted mind. "Damn," Eddie mumbled, his heart thumping. "What the hell is that?" He reached for the CB mic, but before he could key it, a voice crackled through the speaker. It was jumbled, barely audible, but distinct enough to chill Eddie's. Eddie's hand froze over the CB as the voice hissed low and distorted. "Anyone hear me? Anybody out there?" The voice wasn't your typical trucker. It was too faint and desperate. He stared at the radio for a long time before bringing the microphone to his lips, saying, "This is Big Retty. You all right out there?" He waited in silence, his eyes darting. The lights ahead flickered brighter for a moment between the road and the CB, then faded into the black desert sky. His truck continued to rumble, pushing through the uneasiness that weighed heavily on his chest. And then the voice came again. Big Rig. Eddie's blood ran cold. His hand slipped off the microphone, and his pulse raced. The voice crackled louder tonight, and you could see it, but Eddie slammed the microphone down and pressed the gas. The truck roared forward, picking up speed, tires and screeching on the asphalt as he tried to put distance between himself and the person. He hadn't disclosed his handle or revealed his name to anyone. Eddie jerked his head to the left and gasped as the lights, which were pacing his truck and glowing bright in the darkness at window level as if they were stars, reappeared. Whatever was on that road behind him caused his heart to thud in its chest and sent a sharp spike of adrenaline through him. He swerved to the right, trying to get away from whatever it was, but the lights remained with him, floating effortlessly alongside the truck. If they had no weight or substance. "Big Rig Edie," the voice whispered again, but the SE was silent at this point. "My heart pounded in my ears," he said, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts, echoing everywhere and nowhere inside the cab. Eddie mumbled through clenched teeth, "Hell no, Eddie," his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. He looked at the speedometer, which read 85 miles per hour and climbing, but the lights remained locked on no matter how quickly he pushed the rig. And then, as abruptly as he eased off the gas in an attempt to calm the panic rushing through him, Eddie's heart pounded in his chest, his throat was dry, his pulse was racing, and he told himself to keep driving. They had appeared, the lights had disappeared, and the highway stretched out before him once more, empty and quiet, the desert still and silent in the moonlight. Just keep going. He was going to switch on the radio in the hopes of finding some music to break the stillness when he noticed something else. A figure was standing in the center of the road, barely visible at the edge of his high beams. Eddie's breath caught. It was a tall, thin man with his head bent and his face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. Eddie's foot slammed on the brake. The tires screamed in protest, and the truck skidded across the highway as he struggled to maintain control. The enormous vehicle shuddered to a stop, the front bumper inches from the figure, but the man remained motionless and just stood there, His face, he had his hands hidden by his sides, as if he had been waiting for Eddie. A thick, oppressive silence descended upon the taxi as Eddie's heart pounded, and his hands shook. He leaned out the window. "Hey Eddie, you're all right," Eddie yelled, but the man didn't move or even flinch. Eddie's skin crawled, and his instincts told him to leave. I should have listened to the man, whispering, his voice like gravel against bone, but something held him motionless, staring at the figure. Then, slowly, the man's head rose, the brim of his hat lifting just enough to reveal a pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes staring directly at Eddie. Eddie's pulse skipped a beat as he flung the truck into reverse and slammed the gas. The figure on the road vanished into the night, but Eddie could still feel the gaze of those people watching him, icy and vacant, as he shifted into drive and pushed the vehicle down the highway. The road was blurred beneath the tires, the desert rushing by him with a cloud of terror and adrenaline, and miles Eddie continued to drive the roar of the engine without slowing down or turning around. His hands were slippery with sweat, and his breath came in short, ragged bursts. It wasn't until the dim lights of Flagstaff emerged on the horizon that he was able to finally breathe. Eddie's hands were still shaking as he parked the rig at the truck stop just outside of town, and the bright fluorescent lights of the diner felt like a welcome relief from the oppressive. He sat for a while in the dark of the desert, trying to steady his trembling hands and wiping the perspiration from his brow while still struggling to shake off the events of the previous night. He reached for the CB, half expecting to hear that voice again, but it was completely silent, no static, no crackle, and he flipped the switch, but the radio didn't react. Eddie got out of the truck and entered the diner, shaking his head. The familiar sound of dishes and the smell of fried food brought him back to reality. He slid into a window-facing booth, ordered a black coffee, and sat there quietly, staring out at the highway. The waitress brought his coffee with a long, empathetic smile. Night Eddie looked at the road again, half expecting to see the figure, but he couldn't find the right words to describe what had happened out there on the road. He told himself that the desert plays tricks on your mind, but no matter how many times he tried to convince himself, the memory of those lights and those eyes persisted. Jake Thompson, an experienced truck driver, was transporting a load of machinery across the barren regions of Arizona on a moonless night on Route 66, the kind of night when the darkness seemed to seep into your bones. He was standing there waiting for him, but the highway was currently deserted. The sound of the engine, and as he drove, Jake sipped lukewarm coffee from a thermos and looked ahead at the empty road. He loved the freedom of the highway and the open space stretching out in all directions, but tonight something felt different about the air. The rhythmic bump of the tires on the asphalt had put him into a trance. A comforting routine that made the miles fly by was filled with an eerie quiet that was only occasionally broken by the rustle of wind. He turned on the radio in the hopes of hearing some conversation or a sign of life outside, but static crackled through the speakers before a voice came through, distorted and faint. "Is anyone out there?" Jake asked, straightening up and turning up the volume. "This is Big Rig." "Jake, go ahead," but he turned the dial to look for music and found an old country station, which he let play softly in the background. A few miles down the road, Jake noticed something in the distance, a figure standing by the side of the highway, lit by the faint glow of his headlights. As he approached, he saw that there was no response, just more static. Jake hesitated to pick up hitchhikers because it was dangerous, but the woman looked scared and desperate, so he slowed down and pulled over, the gravel crunching under his tires, needing a ride. She was soaked, her clothes were sticking to her, and her hair hung limp and dark against her pale face. Jake felt a little uneasy, but he forced it aside. "Hop in. I'll take you there," he said, rolling down the window as the woman approached, her face glowing in the truck's headlights. "Please, I need to get to the next town. My car broke down, and I'm all alone out here." As she got into the cab, Jake saw she had neither a bag nor Jake tried to seem comforting as he pulled back into the road. "What's your name?" "Emily," she said, looking out the window. "Anything with her?" "Just the clothes on her back." The woman thanked him several times in a weak voice. "You're my savior," she said. "I thought I'd be stuck out here all night. I didn't believe anyone would stop." So they drove in silence for a while, with faraway voices and tangy guitars filling the air. However, something didn't feel right. Emily sat rigidly in her seat, staring out into the darkness, and the cab's air felt frigid. "Are you okay?" Jake said. "It feels like the night is watching her," as she whispered, barely audible over the music. "I just don't like being out here alone." Jake gave her a half smile to lighten the mood, but she didn't answer, keeping her eyes on the road. The desert playing tricks on you. Jake couldn't get rid of the feeling that something wasn't right as they were driving. He could see Emily's reflection in the rearview mirror, but her eyes were far away. The radio crackled again, breaking the tense silence. "Could anyone hear me?" Jake turned off the music and grabbed the microphone. "This is Big Rig, Jake. What's going on?" "Keep an eye out for the..." Jake's blood ran cold when he turned to face Emily, but she was staring out the window without a reaction. He asked, trying to keep his voice steady, "Who's cursed?" The hitchhiker's voice on the radio repeated, "She lures truckers into her trap. Do not let her ride." Jake's mind buzzed, wondering if this was some sick joke. He looked at Emily once more, asking, "Did you hear that?" His voice was shaky, and she turned to him slowly, her eyes narrowing. "What did they say?" Jake said, trying to brush it off, but the uneasiness grew like a storm cloud in his stomach, and he wanted to kick her out there, but something stopped him. The road went on forever, and the scenery around them grew more and more bleak, except for the truck, the woman, and the dark void of the desert. Jake tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. "Where are you headed?" he asked, desperate to change the subject. "I just want to get out of this place," she said in a low, eerie voice as they drove on in silence, the tension growing like fog. Jake couldn't get rid of the feeling that he was being watched, and every glance in the mirror showed Emily's unblinking gaze, her expression unreadable, before the radio suddenly crackled louder this time. "Big Rig." Jake's heart was racing when he turned to face Emily, who was now staring at him with a frightening intensity. "You need to get out," he said, his voice shaking as he asked, "Why did she ask?" Her tone was sharp, and her eyes narrowed. "I thought you were helping me, but things aren't what they seem." "Emily, just get out," he said, nervously looking at the road. He swerved to the side of the road and slammed on the brakes. But before he could unbuckle his seatbelt, Emily's expression changed. A cold smile appeared on her face, revealing something strange underneath the surface. "You picked me up. You have to take me to the diner. Please just get out." "I'm not going anywhere," she replied, her voice suddenly icy. "I've been waiting for someone like you, Jake." He felt the weight of dread settle in his stomach. "Get out. I'm serious." But she leaned closer, her breath cold against his skin. "Leave, Jake." His pulse quickened. "What are you talking about?" "Remember me," she said, her voice lowering to a whisper. Jake struggled for the door handle, but Emily's hand sprang out, gripping his arm with an unnatural strength. He yelled, trying to break free, but the radio blared to life, a cacophony of voices. "It took too long to stop the last time, but I won't let you go again." The truck's interior was cold, and he could see his breath misting in the air. With a rush of adrenaline, Jake ripped himself free from her hold and threw the door open, staggering out into the cool night air. His heart pounded as he ran, the gravel crunching underfoot, and he looked back at the truck Emily was driving. Voices shouting warnings drowned out the sound of his own heartbeat. He didn't look back as he ran into the darkness, panic driving every step. The desert was vast, but he ran with everything he had, desperate to escape whatever curse she carried. Behind him, he stood in the taxi, her eyes glowing in the darkness, and she called, "You can't leave me." Her voice echoed in the silence, "You're mine." Jake's breath caught when the truck's engine roared to life, and its tires screeched as it peeled away. From his shoulder, he turned to see Emily's face, looking out the window with a sly smile on her face, and she yelled, "You can't run from me," her voice echoing in the night. When he looked up, the world seemed to be motionless and the stars above twinkled, but they seemed cold and far away. Then he heard a low hum that was getting louder and vibrating through the ground. It was the sound of the truck turning around and returning for a second. Suddenly, he stumbled and fell to the ground as fear overcame him. As he stumbled to his feet in search of a place to hide, panic struck him again. The flat desert stretched out in all directions, and the truck's headlights pierced the darkness, illuminating the sand and sagebrush. Jake's heart raced, but he knew that no matter how quickly he ran, she would always be there, lurking. "Why won't you stop running?" she called, her voice echoing in the silence. "I just want to take you home." Just behind him, the truck screeched to a stop, and the doors swung open, and Emily emerged, her figure silhouetted against the glow of the headlights, a haunting presence in the night. Jake staggered backward in fear. He screamed, "Stay away from me." "Why are you afraid?" she asked, her smile growing. "You've seen what I can do. You can't escape your fate." The realization struck him like a lightning bolt. She wasn't just a hitchhiker, she was a specter of the road, a haunting figure that preyed on lost. The earth shook beneath him, shadows swirled around dark forms. "Souls, leave me alone," he yelled, desperation beginning to creep into his voice. But Emily simply laughed, a terrible sound that sent shivers down his spine. "You can't escape me, Jake. I'm part of this highway now, I'll always be here." Jake's heart raced as he turned to run again after emerging from the sand to join her in the night. But it was too late. The shadows had closed in around him, their icy presence suffocating. "Welcome to the curse," Emily said, her voice encircling him like shackles. "You'll never." The next morning, truckers would pass the location on Route 66 with the sun shining brightly, but they would tell stories about the eerie hitchhiker who enticed drivers into the night, warning each other with hushed tones. Jake realized that the highway was a place where the hitchhiker's curse was real as the darkness enveloped him. It was a starless night on I-40, the type of night that swallows sound, leaving only the dull roar of the engine Tom's large rig, Carter, had been on, and if you listen carefully, you may hear the echo of Jake's screams eternally buried in the emptiness of the desert. Voices warned people to avoid the cursed road. The highway stretched before him, a black ribbon, as he drove his 18-wheeler through the vast emptiness of New Mexico 4 hours. His only companion was his radio, which had been eerily quiet. Tom was an experienced truck driver who had driven this route countless times, but tonight the air felt thick with something unsettling, so he rubbed his eyes. Fighting exhaustion, he reached for the coffee thermos in the hopes of getting a boost of energy. However, as he was pouring, he noticed a flash of light in the rearview mirror. The headlights were rapidly approaching him, tailgating him. Tom scowled, thinking that it was strange that someone would be out here at this hour, especially at such a high speed. He looked at the speedometer, which read more than 100. Tom's heart raced as he felt the tension in the air as the car pulled up alongside him. "Hey there, Tom," he muttered, gripping the wheel tighter as the car drew closer. He could see the shape of a dark sedan, sleek and menacing, the driver weaving in and out of the lane. A moment later, the sedan suddenly slowed down, veering onto the shoulder. Tom's instincts told him to keep driving, but something forced him to look back. He was leaning out the window, but the driver didn't react, so they accelerated, darted ahead, and then swerved back into his lane. "Crazy bastard," Tom complained, shaking his head. The truck's headlights illuminated the driver's silhouette as they stood by the car, waving wildly. Tom hesitated, then pulled over. "What's wrong?" he asked, rolling down the window. The figure was a young man, his face pale and frantic. "You have to help me," he said cautiously, his stomach churning. "Who's coming?" Without waiting for a response, the man leapt into the passenger seat, slamming the door behind him. Tom hit the gas, his heart thumping as he looked in the truck. Before the man could react, headlights appeared in the distance, growing larger and brighter. The young man's eyes widened in terror. "You don't understand, they'll kill us both." As the young man yelled, "Don't let them catch us, Tom," and pushed the truck to its limit. The other car's headlights were clearly visible in the rearview mirror. It was a dark, sleek sedan that was closing quickly. The other car was right on their tail, aggressive and relentless. "What do they want, Tom?" As they were heading down the highway, the pursuing car swerved violently in an attempt to box them in, turning Tom's knuckles white on the steering wheel hold. He swerved to the left, narrowly avoiding a collision, and the truck shuttered. "They think I know something," he shouted, trying to keep his voice steady. The man gasped, "But I don't," he swore. About a mile up, the man responded in a panicked voice, "Where's the nearest exit?" As he swerved into the opposite lane, the oncoming headlights blinding him. Tom turned right, making a sharp right at the next exit, and as they sped down a dark, country road, he could hear the pursuing car's engine roaring behind them, determined not to let them. As they tore through the night, Tom's thoughts raced with questions about who was after them and what they wanted. The questions hung heavy in the air as the road's trees blurred past and the headlights behind them suddenly appeared. "Escape. Just keep driving," the young guy urged, terror imprinted on his face. "Don't stop until we lose them," flickered. "They're losing us," Tom yelled, his heart pounding. But just as hope was beginning to rise, the other car pulled forward, its headlights illuminating a dark figure standing in the middle of the road. Tom slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck screeching to a stop. "What the hell?" Tom exclaimed, his heart sinking, as the figure approached a woman with wild hair, and it was too late when Tom's instincts took over and he swerved to avoid the woman. The truck was veering off the road into a ditch, and the world spun as they crashed, glass shattering and metal crunching. Tom braced himself as the truck came to a stop, smoke billowing from the engine. She was disheveled, her eyes wild with fear, and she cried, raising her arms, and the young man yelled, "Keep going." Tom looked back, his stomach sinking as the pursuing car stopped, its headlights illuminating the truck wreckage, and shadows moved around the car in darkness. Dazed, Tom blinked, trying to get his bearings, and turned to face the young man who was staring out the window. "Frozen in fear, they're here," he whispered, his voice trembling. Figures appeared out of the darkness, and Tom screamed, "We have to leave," rushing to open his door. But before he could do so, the young man grabbed his arm and said, "You don't understand, they'll take us." The figures approached, their faces hidden in the shadows, and Tom's heart began to race as he felt the weight of there before Tom could process the words. The first figure arrived at the truck. Leaned down and peered inside, its eyes glowing like embers, asking, "Who are they?" Tom yelled, desperation creeping into his voice. "Hunters," the young man cried. "Hunt people like us." Tom growled as he glanced at the young man who was trembling in terror. "We have to run," Tom yelled, but the man's face changed, his eyes wide with recognition. "No, they'll know," Tom said. Suddenly, the second figure was at the passenger side, yanking the door open. The young man scrambled back in his seat, screaming. Tom rushed for the door, but the hunters were too quick and caught him, dragging him out of the truck while his screams echoed in the night. "Help me," he cried, panicking, his voice bursting with desperation, and he cried, "Get back," but the hunters persisted in dragging him into the shadows, his cries fading into the darkness as Tom felt his heart thumping in his chest. He tried to understand what was happening. The voice inside him screamed. With all the strength he could muster, Tom threw himself out of the truck and ran into the night, running into the thick underbrush branches that scratched at his skin as the night closed in around him. He could hear the hunter's footsteps thundering in pursuit behind him. Tom stumbled through the trees, gasping for air, feeling the weight of their gaze on him and an unseen force pulling him back. He didn't look back because fear was pushing him forward, and the world around him was a blur, the darkness swallowing him whole, but he could still hear the hunters' voices echoing in the distance like a haunting melody. As he approached the horror, he abruptly burst through the trees and onto a dirt road that was lit by the faint glow of a nearby gas station. Hope swelled inside of him, and he ran toward the light, his heart pounding. He yelled in a desperate and hurrah voice, and, as he arrived at the gas station, he noticed the flickering neon sign, a beacon in the darkness, but as he got closer, he noticed something odd. The station was deserted, the doors were locked, and panic shot through him. "Hello," he yelled, hammering on the door, but there was no response, only the sound of his own breath, and he looked back, half expecting the hunters to come out. Tom backed away from the door, searching for a way out, but the hunters were on him, their presence suffocating him. Then he heard a faint whisper rise from the darkness, "Join us," and spin around, his heart pounding. Figures were closing in, shadows spilling from the trees, their eyes glinting with a predatory hunger. "Predatory hunger," he pleaded. "Please don't," as the blackness enveloped him. But their laughter sounded in his ears, chilling him to the bone. One of them hissed as it approached, a malicious smile growing across its face. "You can't avoid your fate," Tom thought, as the world around him started to blur. He fought against the darkness that enveloped him like a shroud as he was drawn into the shadows, but it was too late, because the night had already overtaken him. The gas station was silent, the flickering lights were creating eerie shadows on the ground, and in the distance, a truck engine sounded across the deserted highway. But nobody would ever stop. The hunters would wait ever vigilantly for the next unwary traveler on the desolate highway, and they would swallow the road whole, leaving only whispers of the lost tales of those who went too far into the dark and never came back. "Feel free to adjust or let me." It was a moonless night on Interstate 4, and the darkness seemed to engulf everything. Mike "Rad King" Thompson was driving his large rig, transporting a load of steel over the vast New Mexico desert, and the buzz of the engine was a familiar comfort. But tonight there was an eerie tension in the air. The clock struck midnight outside. The scenery changed into a chasm, with the only signs of life being the sporadic flickering lights of far-off gas stations. Mike adjusted his cap and took a swig of coffee from his thermos, but the bitter beverage did little to dispel the nagging discomfort. Mike leaned closer, intrigued. "This is Road King. What's your 20? Listen up, folks. There's something weird going on out here tonight. Be on the lookout." The radio crackled to life, and a voice broke through the static. "Breaker, any truckers out there?" Mike asked. Before Mike could reply, the voice faded and was replaced by static. A few miles down the road, Mike saw a flicker of headlights in his rearview mirror. A dark pickup was approaching him, weaving dangerously between lanes. "What's this idiot doing?" he muttered, gripping the steering wheel. Mike scowled, dismissing. "It is just another trucker's tale." The road ahead was empty, stretching on like an endless ribbon. As the pickup drew closer, Mike looked over and saw that the driver was a disheveled man with his face partially covered by a baseball cap. He yelled something, but Mike couldn't hear over the wind, so he shouted back, "Get a grip, buddy," trying to ignore the man's unpredictable behavior. However, the pickup driver wasn't finished and swerved dangerously close, and Mike's heart was racing when the pickup suddenly darted ahead and slammed on its brakes, forcing Mike to react quickly. Then, the radio crackled again, this time with a frantic voice saying, "Road King, you need to get off this highway, it's not safe." Mike's pulse quickened. "What do you do?" He shook his head, dismissing it as nonsense, but a feeling of dread came over him as he drove further, and the pickup was nowhere to be seen. "There's a shadow on the road. It's hunting," he said, letting out a deep breath as the tension eased. He noticed a woman standing by the side of the road, her clothes tattered, her hair wild, and her eyes wide with fear. Mike slowed down out of curiosity and called out, "I need a lift," and the woman hurried to the door, her face pale. "Please, you have to help me," he said, feeling a chill creep through the cab as if the air itself had thickened, when he asked, "What's wrong?" with worrying in his voice. "They're coming for me," she gasped and looked over her shoulder, her eyes wide with panic. "Who's coming?" Mike asked, but before she could respond, a shadow in the distance flickered, widening the woman's eyes even more. "We have to go now," Mike nodded, following his instincts. He opened the door and she hopped in, slamming it shut behind her drive. She pushed, her voice trembling, and without hesitation, he pressed the throttle, causing the truck to roar to life as they flew away. Mike looked in the rearview mirror, and the darkness appeared to pulse as shadows danced along the roadway. Mike's fingers tightened on the wheel. "Hunts?" he questioned, trying to keep his voice calm. "I don't know how to describe it, but it's like a nightmare come to life, and you can feel it watching. Hunts at night," she mumbled, her voice shaking. Mike's heart raced as he saw the shadows growing darker and more distinct along the roadside as they drove, and he couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was hiding just out of his headlights. Suddenly, the radio crackled once more, alerting him to danger. "Turn around and get off the road, Road King," the woman sobbed, clutching the armrest. "We need to get out of here." Mike slammed the accelerator, determined to put distance between them and whatever was pursuing them. But the air grew heavier and the shadows thicker as he said, "Highway, why, what's happening?" As night fell, the truck suddenly jerked severely, and Mike screamed as he struggled to regain control. The engine sputtered and the headlights flickered, and the woman screamed, her face going pale with fear. Mike yelled, "Hold on, Mike," as he tried to keep the truck steady. With a deafening roar, the truck sputtered and stalled. Darkness engulfed them, the engine went silent, and Mike's stomach fell as he struggled with the steering wheel, his heart thumping in his chest as the shadows outside twisted and mingled with a menacing presence just beyond the light. The woman's voice was desperate. "Are you crazy?" Mike retaliated, but a chilly breeze that carried whispers sent shivers down his spine. She insisted on unbuckling her seatbelt, and Mike had no choice but to follow her. They both fell out of the truck, landing on the gravel with a thud. "Where do we go?" Mike gasped in the cold air. As they ran deeper into the darkness, Mike looked back at the truck, which was now only a silhouette against the night. "Do you know where we're going?" he asked, breathless. "Just keep running." "Woods," she shouted, pointing toward a dark expanse of trees. Mike nodded head, adrenaline pumping through him as they ran into the forest. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, an almost tangible force pursuing them. Branches snapped underfoot as she pleaded. Panic rose in her voice, and they sank farther into the forest, the air getting colder and more oppressive as shadows darted between the trees, taunting them and whispering their names. Mike yelled, "Please, let's find shelter," as desperation began to creep in. At that moment, they discovered an old, abandoned cabin with windows. There was a broken door with a jar hanging inside, and the lady yelled as she ran toward it. They then rushed through the door and slammed it shut behind them. The cabin was dark and the air was heavy with dust. Mike said, "Do you have a phone?" And she quickly searched the room, saying, "No, I lost mine." Her voice was shaking, and they huddled. "I don't know," she gasped, tears streaming down her face. "I was just driving home when it appeared in the road, and I barely avoided a shadow passing by the window." Hearts were racing in the corner, listening for any movement outside, and the whispers were getting louder and swirling around them, chilling to the bone. They both froze as the whispers grew louder and could be heard reverberating throughout the cabin. Join us," Mike said, his chest tightening with fear as he asked, "What does that mean?" She whispered, her eyes wide with horror. And then the door creaked open, swinging wide on its hinges. Darkness filled the room, and a figure appeared. Mike shouted and grabbed her hand as they ran toward the back of the cabin, But as they got there, the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The figure stepped closer, a dark silhouette against the dim light joining us, hissing its voice in a cheery whisper that I could feel. The figure was tall and menacing, cloaked in shadows. Mike fought back against the darkness, reaching for the door, feeling the whisper swirling around him, taunting him, but the darkness was too strong. The woman cried, tears streaming down her face, and Mike felt the cold seeping into his bones. As the shadows wrapped around him and pulled him toward the figure, Mike exhorted him to give in and join us, but he refused. With a last effort, he threw himself against the door, and it exploded, sending them staggering into the night with the darkness howling behind them. "Keep running," Mike urged, and they ran into the woods, their hearts thumping in their chests. But the figure followed it. There are whispers in the night that you can't escape from, so they ran until they could hear them no more. Eventually, the shadows started to fade, and they came to a road. "There," the woman shouted, pointing to a car, and they ran toward it while waving their arms. When the car slowed and the driver rolled down the window, he asked, "Please, we need to get out of here." Mike yelled without hesitation, and the driver opened the door, and they jumped inside, slamming it shut as they drove off. Mike looked back at the woods, which were disappearing. Mike felt a shiver run up his spine as he asked the woman behind them, "What was that thing?" She said, "I don't know," her voice trembling, "but it's not over. It will always be looking for us." The night had swallowed their escape, and as they continued to drive, he couldn't get rid of the feeling that the shadow was still out there, waiting for its next victim, somewhere on the desolate road. The legend of the shadow on Route 66 spread among truckers as a warning to those who dared to drive through the haunted night, as whispers continued to echo the names of those lost to the darkness. If you have any specific requests or changes in mind, please don't hesitate to let me know. Jack Iron Horse Reynolds was driving his 18-wheeler on a section of Highway 37 where the stars hardly broke the night's veil. The sound of the engine was a familiar lullaby, but tonight there was an eerie tension in the air. He had been driving for more than 10 hours, and the exhaustion was seeping into his bones like a thick. He rode the winding road through the California hills in the fog. He turned on the radio in the hopes of finding some company. Static crackled before a voice called out to all truckers on Highway 37, "Be on the lookout for strange reports of a phantom hitchhiker." Jack laughed darkly and shook his head, thinking, this is just another ghost story. But he had heard the stories before. He couldn't get rid of the urban legends that were going around among truckers. But a few miles down the road, he noticed headlights in his rearview mirror getting bigger and bigger. A sleek black pickup was following him too closely for comfort. "What's wrong with this jerk?" Jack thought, clutching the steering wheel. The pickup swerved to the side and pulled up beside him. Jack looked over and saw that the driver, a young man with wild eyes, was just making frantic gestures. Jack rolled down his window and said, "What's wrong?" "Get off this road." Panic was written on his face. Jack asked, perplexed, "The hitchhiker, she's real. Get away." Before Jack could react, the pickup speeded off into the night. "What a nut," Jack muttered, shaking his head as he rolled up the window. But uneasiness settled in his stomach like a heavy stone. He pressed on the darkness that was closing in around him, and a few minutes later, he noticed a woman standing by the side of the road. Jack's heart raced as he wondered, is this the hitchhiker, recalling the stories he had heard? He slowed down, his interest piqued, and as he got closer, the woman held up her hand to indicate for him to stop. Jack hesitated, but finally pulled. Over on the gravel, he yelled, "I need a lift," and opened the door. The woman approached, her face lit by the truck's headlights, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and desperation. "Please, I need to leave," he said, frowning, sensing that something was wrong. "Where are you heading just now?" Jack tried to defuse the situation by asking, "What's going on? Why are you out here alone?" "I was just driving home when I saw her," and she pleaded, looking nervously over her shoulder against his better judgment. He nodded and allowed her to buckle up, and they were off the truck, rumbling back onto the highway. Was standing by the road looking lost, and I thought she needed help. When I stopped, though, it seemed like she wanted me to join her. Jack's grip tightened on the wheel, and she swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously. "She's not human," she said. "She wants to take people." Jack shook his head, trying to brush her words aside. He looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the crazy-eyed driver again, but it was just darkness. "Are you sure you're okay?" Ghost story. There is no such thing as a hitchhiker who takes people, but deep down annoying fear settled. In the road ahead was dark, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. As Jack noticed the woman's pale appearance, he said, "I just can't go back. I don't want to see her again." Her voice was barely above a whisper, and Jack's curiosity was piqued. "Yes, she's a warning. A spirit that lures you in. I've seen her before," Jack said, feeling a chill go down his spine, but he persisted. "What do you mean you've seen her before?" "I was driving. She picked us up with my friend, but after she paused and took a shaky breath, my friend vanished. I thought I could help, but Jack's heart raced as he processed her words. "And now you think she's after you?" The woman nodded, her hands shaking, and I could feel her getting close right before the truck's headlights appeared. He squeezed the pedal, but the truck started to slow down. The engine groaned, "Come on, not now," and Jack clenched his teeth, attempting to keep the truck steady and keep driving, while the woman screamed and her eyes widened in terror. The woman cried, pointing, "Don't look," but Jack couldn't resist turning his head and seeing her, a translucent figure in a tattered white dress with flowing hair just at the edge of the headlights in a shadow, moving along the road with ease. The woman urged him to drive faster, her eyes hollow and dark like smoke. Panic rose in her voice, and he slammed the accelerator to the floor, but the truck was losing power. The ghostly figure appeared to smile, her mouth opening unnaturally wide, and a bone-chilling laugh reverberated in the night air. "We're not going to make it," Jack yelled in fear. Jack's heart pounded as he struggled against the dying engine. The woman's eyes were fixed on the figure, and her expression changed from one of fear to one of recognition. "Don't let her in. Anything you do," she screamed, clutching the dashboard. "Don't listen to her," she yelled. It was too late. The headlights flickered one final time before fading into darkness. The truck came to a stop, the engine died, and Jack said in a trembling voice, "No, she get us." The woman screamed, but the door abruptly opened as though drawn by an invisible force, and her voice broke the stillness. In a desperate attempt, Jack charged for the door as a chilly breeze swept over him, but something grabbed him by the wrist and pulled him back. He turned to see the hitchhiker, her face inches from his, whispering her breath and chilling him to the bone. Jack yelled, "Get away from me." Jack felt a rush of adrenaline as the darkness closed in around him. The woman yelled, but her voice was being overpowered by the spirits laughing. Instead, he shouted, breaking free from the grip and stumbling backward. He ran toward the trees lining the road, not looking back. He pushed through the underbrush, adrenaline fueled by his escape, but the darkness felt alive, as if it were alive. Branches scratched at his skin as he plunged into the darkness, but he didn't care because survival was all that mattered. Behind him, he could hear laughter reverberating through the night, the whispers calling his name. "We're grabbing him and attempting to pull him back. Please let me go." He gasped and fought the shadow's pull, and after what seemed like an eternity, he staggered into a clearing, trembling and out of breath. The laughter subsided, and Jack had fled and fell to the ground, panting for air. However, the fear continued to haunt him, and he knew he couldn't turn back to the road before the moon eventually emerged from the clouds, as he had witnessed lighting up the clearing, and Jack briefly believed he was safe. But then he heard a faint, sneaky whisper on the wind that you can't. Jack remained in the clearing, too scared to go, as dawn broke. Could see the night's eyes on him while he waited for him to get back on the road. And as the sun roses were shining on the route, and Jack realized that certain roads or some ghosts never fully let go of the stories of the places that are better left uninhabited. Truckers would whisper warnings to hitchhikers on Highway 37, spoke of the darkness that hid someplace along the lonely road and beyond the headlights. Feel free to ask for anything. Hitchhiker would wait for her next victim, while her laughter reverberated throughout the night. Modifications or more information. It was a night without a moon on Highway 95, the type of night that the road was, covered in a spooky darkness. Tom Big Rig Harris had been hours of driving with his 18-wheeler's hum providing a constant background to his as an experienced truck driver. He had witnessed his fair share of strange things while traveling. However, he turned on the radio tonight because something didn't feel right, and he was looking for a voice to fill the void. Crackled through the static, demanding immediate and panicked attention from all drivers. Highway 95 is a dangerous place. To be a hitchhiker, Tam scowled. He had heard stories about spectral hitchhikers in the past, but he always ignored them. But when he looked in the rearview mirror, a spooky coldness swept over him. The road was deserted, yet a few kilometers later, he noticed that the shadows appeared to dance along the edges, whispering secrets he couldn't comprehend. Against his better judgment, a woman in a white dress with wild hair standing on the side of the road appears lost. Judgment, he yelled out, letting the words tumble out of his mouth, and slowed down. Needing a ride, lips, the woman moved closer. Before he could think, her eyes wide and beseeching. Please, I need help. Tom hesitantly opened the door, but she insisted. Where are you going? Just drive. She climbed into the taxi, her breath coming in short gasps, and he drove with the headlights shining. What's your name? He inquired, attempting to make contact with the vacant road ahead. Addressing Anna, she answered in a quivering voice. I shouldn't have gone out, given that she is searching for me. Anna, why didn't he ask more questions? Muttered, looking anxiously out into the night, wondering who the hitchhiker is that she wants to. Tom's spine tingled, but he faked a laugh, saying, Take me back, nothing is out here, Anna. But as the miles passed, the atmosphere became heavier, and for some reason he felt compelled to look in the rearview mirror. He briefly believed he saw a shadow move behind them. What's wrong? Anna questioned in her voice. He lied while trembling and gripping the wheel more tightly, yet uncertainty gnawed at him. Suddenly, the lights went out and the motor stuttered. No, 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 Tom cried. The truck paused before roaring back to life after pounding the throttle pedal. Tom pushed the truck harder as Anna screamed in fear as life continued to drive. However, the air became chilly as the darkness seemed to close in on them, and Tom sensed a menacing presence behind him. And then suddenly a figure appeared in the headlights. A ghostly Anna that was just like her but incorrect, malicious eyes. Join me, the apparition said. Tom yelled, Get away from her. As he reached out with a skeletal hand, his heart pounding. Tom struggled to keep the real Anna from entering as she screamed and clutched her head, maintain his focus while swerving the truck while the ghostly shadows whirled around them. With all of his last efforts, he pushed the accelerator as the figure beckoned, attempting to escape the darkness, but the path led them in a winding manner. Further into the nightmare, the truck eventually stumbled ahead, its engine stuttering once more. Tom slapped the brakes in desperation, and they skittered to a stop. Get out, he cried. He heard the shadows' laughter reverberating in the night. Run, Anna, as they both clambered out of the taxi. They shouted and fled into the tree branches, rubbing their skin. Breathless and frightened, they staggered through the underbrush, but Tom could feel the darkness encroaching on them. Keep going, Anna pushed, but exhaustion was starting to set in, and at last they arrived at a clearing moonlight. They paused, panting for oxygen, but the laughter continued to pour down like a beacon of hope. What should we do now that we followed them? Chilling their bones. With horror in his voice, Tom said, Don't look back, Anna forewarned her. Tom was overcome with fear. Yet he couldn't resist turning to see the hitchhiker, she said once more, as she stood at the edge of the clearing, her ghostly image glistening in the moonlight, joining us. Tom yelled in desperation, as a wave of despair swept over him. Anna abruptly grasped his arm. We must return. We cannot allow her to without wasting any time. They turned and sprinted in the direction of the highway. Hearing the sound of footsteps behind them indicated that the hitchhiker was closing in on them. When they arrived at the road, headlights and a truck with assistants appeared in the distance. Tom shouted and furiously waved his arms as the vehicle slowed and the driver's eyes widened. We need to leave this place because we are confused about what is happening. When Anna begged, the driver opened the door without hesitation, and they leapt. Tom took a final look back as they drove away, slamming it shut behind them. When the hitchhiker was standing by the side of the road, her face was twisted with anger. Anna urged, her voice trembling, as the blackness swirled around her like a storm. Even as the sun started to rise, the driver pressed the throttle pedal, and they sped along the highway, leaving the nightmare behind, giving the road a cozy glow. And Tom couldn't get rid of the sensation that they had. The whispers lingered in the back of his mind, like a haunting voice. Recollection of the shadows that were someplace on that lonely section of Highway 95, just beyond the headlights. Hitchhiker waited for her next move, while her laughter reverberated in the wind. Victim, please inquire if you need any changes or more information.